Take out your wallet. Look inside. What do you see? Paper, plastic cards, maybe some metal coins. Maybe nothing at all because everything is on your phone now. But think about this for a moment. Why is this paper worth anything? Why can you exchange it for food, for clothes, for a place to live? It is just paper. You cannot eat it. You cannot wear it. You cannot build a house with it. If you were alone on a desert island, this paper would be completely useless. Yet in society, this paper is everything. People work their entire lives for it. People fight for it. People lie, cheat, and steal for it. Some people kill for it. But here's the strangest part. Money is not real. It is an idea, a shared belief, a collective agreement that we all participate in without really thinking about it. For most of human history, money did not exist. Then humans invented it, and the things we used as money were bizarre. Cowrie shells, giant stone wheels too heavy to move, salt, cacao beans, then coins made from precious metals, then paper backed by gold, then paper backed by nothing but trust. And now? Now money is just numbers on a computer screen. Digital code that exists nowhere and everywhere at the same time. This is the strange history of money. And it starts with a problem. Imagine living 10,000 years ago. You are a hunter. You spent all day tracking and killing a deer. You have meat, lots of meat. More than you and your family can eat before it spoils. Meanwhile, your neighbor spent the day making clay pots. He has pots but no food. This seems simple. You need pots. He needs food, you should trade. But there is a problem. He only needs one small piece of meat. But you need 3 pots. He does not want an entire deer for 3 pots. That is too much. The value does not match. So the trade cannot happen. Even if you could solve that problem, there are bigger problems. Imagine you make shoes. You need grain to feed your family, so you go to the grain farmer. You offer shoes, but the grain farmer does not need shoes right now. He already has shoes. He needs a new tool. So he will not trade with you. You go to the tool maker. You offer shoes for a tool. The tool maker does not need shoes. He needs cloth. You go to the cloth maker. The cloth maker does need shoes, great. But he does not have enough cloth to equal the value of shoes. You need to find someone else who has what the cloth maker wants, trade with them, then come back. It is complicated, exhausting, often impossible. This problem is called the coincidence of wants. For barter to work, you need to find someone who has exactly what you want and wants exactly what you have at exactly the same time. And the value needs to match. This happens sometimes, but not often enough. As human societies grew larger and more complex, barter became impractical. People specialized in making one thing. Farmers grew food, craftsmen made tools, weavers made cloth. But they all needed many different things from many different people. The barter system was breaking down under its own limitations. Imagine a farmer who grows wheat. He needs a new plow, some cloth for clothes, pottery for storage, and medicine for his sick child. He would need to find 4 different people. Each person would need to want wheat. Each person would need to have the right amount of their product to equal the value of the wheat they wanted. And all of this would need to happen before the wheat spoiled or before his child got sicker. The inefficiency was crippling economic growth. Villages could not expand into towns. Towns could not expand into cities. Trade between distant regions was nearly impossible. People needed a solution. They needed something that everyone would accept in trade. Something that could represent value without being the actual thing you wanted. Something that could be stored, divided, and transported. They needed money. But what could serve as money? What would everyone agree to accept? The answer was different in different places, and some of the answers were very strange. On islands across the Pacific Ocean and in parts of Africa, people started using shells as money. Not just any shells. Cowrie shells. Small, shiny shells from a specific type of sea snail. Why cowrie shells? They had several useful qualities that made them ideal as a medium of exchange. They were small and portable. You could carry hundreds of them in a bag. They were durable. Unlike food that rotted or leather that decayed, shells lasted for years without deteriorating. They were difficult to counterfeit because they came from nature with distinctive patterns and a specific shape that was hard to replicate. They were relatively rare, which gave them value, but not so rare that ordinary people could not obtain them through trade or collection. And they were beautiful. Their glossy surface and natural patterns made them desirable for decoration as well as for exchange. People would string them into necklaces or sew them onto clothing. This dual use as both money and adornment actually strengthened their value, so cowrie shells became money. And not just in one place. Cowrie shell money was used independently in China, India, Africa, and Pacific Islands for thousands of years. In some parts of West Africa, cowrie shells were the primary currency until the early 20th century, well into the colonial period. That means these shells served as money for over 4,000 years in some regions. They lasted longer than empires, longer than civilizations, longer than any paper currency in existence today. The Chinese were using cowrie shells as money 3,000 years ago. The character for money in ancient Chinese writing was based on the shape of a cowrie shell. Think about that. The very symbol for money came from these shells. But shells had limitations that became more apparent as economies grew. They were not perfectly divisible. You could not break a shell in half to make smaller change. They were somewhat bulky if you needed to transport large amounts. A wealthy merchant might need to carry thousands of shells for a major transaction, which was cumbersome. And their value could fluctuate based on supply. If someone discovered a new beach full of cowrie shells, suddenly the currency could lose value through inflation. Eventually, as trade expanded and economies became more sophisticated, people needed something better, something more standardized, something easier to divide and combine. In different parts of the world, people chose different objects as money based on what was valuable in their culture. The objects had to be things that everyone valued, things that were useful or rare or both. In ancient China, people used cowrie shells, but also tools. Small bronze spades and knives that were real agricultural implements made smaller and lighter specifically to serve as exchange tokens. These tool-shaped pieces of bronze eventually evolved into round coins, but for centuries, Chinese money literally looked like tiny farming tools. In Central America, the Aztecs and Mayans used cacao beans, the beans used to make chocolate. Cacao was valuable because chocolate drinks were important in their culture, consumed during religious ceremonies and by the elite. The beans were fairly standardized in size, which made them useful for counting and exchange. But the system had vulnerabilities. People could cheat. They could hollow out beans and fill them with dirt, creating fake cacao money. So even this natural currency had problems with counterfeiting. In Ethiopia and parts of East Africa, people used bars of salt as money for centuries. The salt bars were standardized in size and weight. They served as both currency and commodity since salt was essential and valuable. In Yap, a small island in Micronesia in the Pacific, people used perhaps the strangest money in history, giant stone wheels called Rai stones. These were not small tokens you could carry in your pocket. Some were larger than a person, some weighed several tons. The largest known Rai stone is over 3 meters in diameter and weighs more than 4 tons. They were carved from limestone from Palau, an island hundreds of kilometers away, and transported by canoe across dangerous open ocean. The journey was so difficult and dangerous that many people died during these expeditions. This danger and difficulty is what gave the stones their value. The bigger the stone and the more dangerous the journey to create and transport it, the more valuable it was. Some stones had known histories. People remembered which stones had cost lives during transport. Those stones were worth more, but here's the strangest part. The stones were so heavy that they could not be moved easily once they arrived on Yap, so when ownership changed hands during a transaction, the stone itself did not move. It stayed in the same place, sometimes in front of someone's house or on public land. Everyone in the village simply remembered who owned which stone. The ownership was tracked in collective memory and oral tradition. Even if a stone sank to the bottom of the ocean during transport before ever reaching the island, it could still be used as money. One famous Rai stone sank during a storm. The crew survived and told everyone about the stone. Everyone agreed it existed at the bottom of the ocean. Everyone agreed it had value, so it could be bought and sold. Ownership of this invisible sunken stone changed hands multiple times. People traded it, used it to pay debts, all without anyone ever seeing it again. The stone did not need to be physically present. The ownership record existed in collective memory and social consensus. This is remarkable when you think about it. The Yap Islanders invented a form of money that worked almost like a blockchain or digital ledger, thousands of years before computers existed. Value was tracked by communal consensus rather than physical possession. Ownership was transparent to the entire community. Everyone knew who owned what. Transactions required social agreement and public knowledge. It was a distributed ledger maintained by human memory instead of computer servers. This seems primitive, but it reveals something profound about the nature of money. Money does not need to be a physical object you can hold. It just needs to be a shared record that everyone agrees on. The Yap Rai stones prove this. Modern cryptocurrency is not as different from ancient Rai stones as we might think. But the most widespread and important early commodity money was salt. We already know this story from another video, but it connects directly to money. Salt was essential for preserving food before refrigeration existed. It was valuable everywhere humans lived. It was relatively rare and difficult to produce in large quantities. People needed it desperately. And because it was valuable and desired universally, it could be traded for anything. Salt became money. The Latin word for salt is sal. The word for a soldier's salt allowance was salarium. That word became our modern word salary. When you receive your salary today, you are linguistically receiving your salt payment. Roman soldiers were paid partly in salt or given money specifically to buy salt. Salt routes, roads built specifically to transport salt, were as important as trade routes for silk or spices. Cities were founded at salt springs or near salt mines. Wars were fought over access to salt. In medieval Europe, salt taxes made governments wealthy and also sparked rebellions when the taxes became too oppressive. The gabelle, the French salt tax we discussed before, was so hated that it contributed to the French Revolution. Salt was money, salt was power. But salt, like all these commodity monies, had inherent problems as a medium of exchange. It was heavy and bulky. It could not be divided easily into very small amounts for small purchases. It could dissolve or degrade if exposed to moisture. Different regions valued it differently based on local availability. A bag of salt might be worth a lot in one place, and much less in another place near the ocean. What people needed was something that could represent value without being a commodity itself. They needed standardized units that were universally recognizable. They needed coins. Around 600 BC, in the Kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, someone had a brilliant and world-changing idea. Make small pieces of metal in standardized weights and stamp them with an official mark, guaranteeing their value and purity, coins. The first coins were made from electrum, a natural mixture of gold and silver found in local rivers. The king of Lydia, eventually the famous King Croesus, whose wealth became legendary, stamped these coins with his royal seal, usually a lion's head. The stamp was not just decoration, it was a guarantee. The stamp meant the government guaranteed the weight and purity of the metal. You did not need to weigh the coin yourself. You did not need to test whether it was really gold or just gold-plated lead. You could trust the stamp. As long as you trusted the king, you could trust the coin. This was revolutionary. This changed everything. Coins were portable. Much more portable than bags of salt or strings of shells. They were durable. Metal does not rot or decay. A coin could circulate for decades or even centuries. They were divisible into different denominations. You could mint large gold coins for big transactions and tiny copper coins for buying bread. They were hard to counterfeit because of the official stamp and because precious metals themselves were difficult to fake convincingly. And they were made from materials that people already valued independently. Gold and silver were treasured for jewelry and decoration. Even if the coin system collapsed, the metal still had value. The idea spread rapidly across the ancient world. Within a few centuries, Greece, Persia, Rome, India, and China all had their own sophisticated coin systems, each developing independently but following similar principles. Money as we recognize it had been born. Greek city-states minted coins with symbols of their patron gods. Athens put an owl on its coins, representing Athena. These Athenian owls became so trusted and widespread that they were accepted far beyond Athens itself. They became an international currency. Rome minted coins with the faces of emperors, which served both as money and as propaganda, spreading the emperor's image throughout the empire. Chinese coins were distinctive, round with a square hole in the middle so they could be strung together on cords for easy carrying and counting. Coins made trade vastly easier than anything before. A merchant could travel hundreds of miles with a pouch of coins instead of carrying cartloads of actual goods to barter. Buyers and sellers did not need to negotiate the relative value of different commodities. The value was stamped on the coin. Markets became more efficient, economies grew. Specialization increased. Cities expanded, civilization advanced. But coins also introduced new problems, specifically the problem of government manipulation. Governments could cheat. They could mix cheap metals like copper or lead with precious metals like gold or silver, making coins that looked valuable but contained less precious metal than the stamp claimed. This is called debasing the currency. It was tempting for governments facing financial pressure. If you need money to pay soldiers or build monuments, why not stretch your gold supply by mixing it with cheaper metal? You can make more coins from the same amount of gold. The Roman Empire did this repeatedly over centuries, and the consequences were severe. In the early Roman Republic and Empire, the silver denarius coin was nearly pure silver. But as the empire grew, maintaining armies on distant frontiers became enormously expensive. Emperors needed more money. So they started reducing the silver content, first to 90% silver, then 80%, then 50%. By the 3rd century AD, the denarius contained only about 5% silver. It was basically a copper coin with silver coating. People noticed. Of course they noticed. Merchants started demanding more coins for the same goods because each coin was worth less real silver. This is inflation. Prices rose across the empire not because goods became scarcer but because money became less valuable. The government kept minting more coins with less and less silver, trying to keep up with rising prices, which only made inflation worse. Trust in the currency declined. People started hoarding old coins that still had real silver content. They spent the debased new coins as quickly as possible before they lost more value. Some people stopped accepting coins altogether and returned to barter. The monetary system began to break down. This contributed to the broader economic crisis that weakened the Roman Empire. The lesson was clear and has been repeated throughout history. Money only works if people trust it. The moment trust breaks, whether because of debasement, counterfeiting, or overprinting, the system begins to fail. Money is fundamentally a trust system. Break that trust and everything collapses. Despite these dangers, coins dominated world commerce for over 1,000 years. From the invention in Lydia around 600 BC until the widespread adoption of paper money in the 17th and 18th centuries. That is remarkable longevity for a technology, but coins were not perfect. Carrying large amounts of coins was heavy and dangerous. A wealthy merchant conducting major business might need to transport hundreds of pounds of gold and silver coins. This was not only physically difficult but extremely risky. Thieves and bandits knew that merchants carried valuable coins. Robbery was common and often violent. Governments needed to transport huge quantities of coins to pay armies, collect taxes from distant provinces, or conduct international trade. This was expensive, requiring armed guards and secure transportation. The risk and expense created inefficiencies in the economy. People needed something lighter, more convenient, and safer to transport over long distances. They needed paper money. The Chinese invented it first, centuries before Europe. During the Song Dynasty around the 7th century AD, wealthy merchants developed an ingenious system. They would deposit their heavy coins with trusted agents or early bankers in one city and receive paper receipts in return. These receipts documented how much metal the merchant had deposited. The merchant could then travel hundreds of miles carrying only lightweight paper instead of heavy, dangerous metal. When they reached their destination, they could present the paper receipt to another agent in the same network and receive coins there. It was an early form of banking and transfer system. The paper itself had no value, but it represented a claim on valuable metal held elsewhere. This worked because people trusted the network of agents to honor the receipts. By the Song Dynasty in the 10th and 11th centuries, the government recognized the potential and took over the system. They started issuing official paper money, government-printed notes that represented value and could be used directly to buy and sell goods without needing to convert them back to metal. People could use paper money just like coins for daily transactions, but much lighter and more convenient. The government called it jiaozi. This was the first true government-issued paper currency in the world. It was a brilliant innovation that gave the Chinese economy advantages over other regions still relying purely on metal coins. But paper money was also dangerous, more dangerous than coins. And the Chinese learned this lesson painfully through repeated cycles of success and failure. Coins had intrinsic value. They were made of precious metal. Even if the government that issued them fell, even if the empire collapsed, the metal still had value. You could melt down coins and use the metal for other purposes. Paper money was completely different. Paper itself was worthless. You could not eat it. You could not build with it. You could not make tools or jewelry from it. The paper only had value because the government said it did. because people trusted that they could exchange it for something real. This created an enormous temptation for governments. If you need money for a war, or a palace, or to pay government officials, and you control the printing of paper money, why not just print more? It costs almost nothing to print paper compared to mining and refining gold or silver. The Chinese government fell into this trap repeatedly over centuries. They would introduce paper money. It would work well initially. Then they would face some financial crisis, usually an expensive war. They would print more paper money to pay for it. Then more, then even more. More paper money chasing the same amount of goods and services caused inflation. Prices would rise. People would notice that their money bought less than before. Trust would begin to erode. The government would print even more money to keep up with rising prices, which made inflation worse. Eventually, the paper money would become nearly worthless. People would lose faith entirely. They would refuse to accept it. The system would collapse. The government would be forced to abandon paper money and return to metal coins. This happened multiple times in Chinese history. Print paper money. Initial success. Government overprints. Inflation. Loss of trust. Hyperinflation. Collapse. Abandonment. Return to coins. Wait a generation or two, try paper money again. Repeat the whole cycle. The Ming Dynasty tried paper money and eventually gave up on it after inflation destroyed its value. For centuries afterward, China relied primarily on silver coins, many imported from Spanish colonies in the Americas. The lesson was difficult but critical. Paper money only works with discipline. Governments must resist the enormous temptation to print unlimited amounts. They must maintain the trust of the people. Once trust is lost, it is almost impossible to restore, but the lesson was not learned permanently. Even today, governments struggle with this same temptation, and we continue to see the consequences. Europe was slow to adopt paper money, remaining committed to metal coins for much longer than China. For over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, Europeans relied on gold, silver, and copper coins. But by the 17th century, European banks began issuing paper notes, following a path similar to the early Chinese system. These were not government money, at least not initially. These were private banknotes issued by commercial banks. The system worked like this. You could deposit gold or silver coins in a bank for safekeeping. The bank would give you a paper note as a receipt. The note was a promise. It said the bank owed you a certain amount of gold or silver and you could return at any time to claim it. But you did not have to claim it immediately. You could use that paper note to buy things. The seller could either use the note themselves or take it to the bank and exchange it for coins. This was more convenient than carrying heavy coins everywhere. This system worked because of trust. People trusted that the bank actually had the gold and silver it claimed to have in its vaults. That trust was sometimes misplaced. Some banks discovered they could issue more notes than they actually had coins to back them up. They realized that most people never actually came to withdraw their gold. The paper notes circulated as money. So why not issue extra notes? The bank could lend out these extra notes and earn interest. As long as everyone did not try to withdraw their gold at the same time, no one would discover the deception. But sometimes everyone did try to withdraw at once. If rumors spread that a bank was in trouble, people would panic. They would rush to get their gold back before it was gone. This is called a bank run. The first people in line might get their gold. But the bank did not have enough gold for everyone. The bank would fail, collapse, close its doors. People holding that bank's notes would lose everything. The paper became worthless. Bank runs and bank failures were common in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. People lost their life savings. Trust in the banking system would collapse temporarily, then slowly rebuild. Then another crisis, another panic, another round of bank failures. Governments eventually took over the paper money system to create more stability. By the 19th and 20th centuries, most countries had government-issued paper currency. Central banks were created to manage the money supply and regulate commercial banks. But even government paper money still maintained a link to precious metal, usually gold or silver. The government promised that you could, in theory, exchange your paper money for a specific amount of gold. This was called the gold standard, and it dominated the global economy for about a century. The gold standard worked like this. Governments declared that their currency was worth a fixed amount of gold. For example, the United States set the price at $20 per ounce of gold in the 19th century. If you had $20 in paper money, you could theoretically go to a bank and exchange it for 1 ounce of gold. This created a hard limit on how much money governments could print. They could only print as much paper as they had gold. This prevented unlimited printing and runaway inflation. It created stability and predictability. International trade worked smoothly because currencies had clear gold values. Countries could not easily cheat by printing unlimited money. Other countries could demand gold in payment, and you had to deliver actual gold. This discipline forced fiscal responsibility. Or so the theory went. In reality, governments frequently bent or broke the rules. They printed more money than they had gold. Usually no one did because most people never actually tried to exchange their paper for gold. For daily transactions, the paper worked perfectly fine. The gold backing was more of a psychological anchor, a promise that gave people confidence in the currency. As long as people believed they could get gold if they wanted to, they did not actually need to get it. The belief was enough. But the gold standard had serious problems that became apparent during economic crises. It was rigid. During recessions or depressions, when the economy desperately needed more money circulating to create jobs and stimulate growth, governments could not print more money. They were locked in by the gold limit. They had to watch unemployment rise and businesses fail because they could not increase the money supply. This made recessions deeper and longer than they needed to be. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, many countries abandoned the gold standard. The countries that left the gold standard earliest generally recovered faster. This taught economists that sometimes you need flexibility in monetary policy. After World War II, a new international system emerged called Bretton Woods, named after the New Hampshire town where the agreement was negotiated. The Bretton Woods system was a modified gold standard. The US dollar was backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Other countries' currencies were not backed directly by gold, but were backed by US dollars. So indirectly, most of the world's money was still connected to gold. This system created stability for international trade and helped rebuild the global economy after the war's devastation. But it was also inherently unstable. The system required the United States to maintain absolutely enormous gold reserves to back all the dollars. As the U.S. economy grew and dollars spread around the world through trade and foreign aid, the amount of dollars far exceeded the amount of gold. Other countries knew this. They knew there was not enough gold. Some countries, particularly France under President Charles de Gaulle, started demanding gold. Gold flowed out of U.S. reserves. The system was breaking down. By the late 1960s, it was clear the Bretton Woods system could not continue. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made a shocking announcement that changed the world economy forever. He declared that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. The promise was broken. The gold standard was dead. This was supposed to be a temporary suspension, but it became permanent. The world moved to a new system, fiat currency. What happened next was remarkable. The global economy did not collapse. The dollar did not become worthless. People kept using dollars, kept using pounds, francs, yen, and all the other currencies that were no longer backed by gold. Why? Because money had never really been about gold. Money was about trust, about collective belief, about agreements between people and institutions. The gold backing was psychological. A security blanket, a reassurance. Once it was gone, people realized they did not actually need it. Dollars still worked perfectly well for buying and selling. Governments still accepted them for taxes. Banks still held them. People still wanted them, so people kept using them. The fiction continued, the collective belief persisted. Governments could now print as much money as they wanted, limited only by the risk of inflation and loss of public trust. This new system is called fiat currency. Fiat is a Latin word meaning, let it be done, or by decree. Fiat currency has value because the government says it does and because the law requires people to accept it for debts and taxes. Not because it is backed by anything physical. Your money today is backed by nothing except trust in the government, trust in the economy, and trust in the collective agreement that this paper or these digital numbers represent value. Think about that. The money in your wallet right now has no intrinsic value whatsoever. It is not backed by gold or silver or anything tangible. It is just paper or metal or digital bits that we all agree to treat as valuable. It is a collective fiction, a shared hallucination. And that fiction works remarkably well most of the time. Modern economies run on fiat currency, but it requires trust. When trust collapses, so does the currency. We have seen this happen repeatedly throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. In Germany after World War I, the government printed massive amounts of money to pay war reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles. This caused hyperinflation that destroyed the German mark. At the peak of the crisis in 1923, prices doubled every few days. A loaf of bread that cost a few marks in the morning might cost thousands by afternoon. People needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy basic groceries. Life savings became worthless overnight. People who had worked their whole lives and saved carefully found themselves destitute. The German mark collapsed completely. It had to be replaced with a new currency. The social and economic trauma contributed to political instability. Similar hyperinflation destroyed currencies in Hungary after World War II, where the inflation rate reached incomprehensible levels. In Zimbabwe in the 2000s, government printing of money to pay for political expenses caused such severe hyperinflation that they eventually printed a $100 trillion banknote. The note was worth less than $1. People stopped using Zimbabwean currency altogether and switched to US dollars and South African rand. Venezuela has experienced devastating hyperinflation in recent years due to government mismanagement and excessive money printing. When governments print too much money, or when people lose faith in the government's ability to manage the economy, the currency can spiral into worthlessness. The collective belief vanishes, the fiction fails, and people suffer terribly. Meanwhile, as paper money dominated the 20th century, another revolution was brewing quietly. Digital money. It started simply with credit cards in the 1950s. Instead of carrying cash, you could use a plastic card. The card represented a line of credit from a bank. You could buy things now and pay the bank later. The transaction was recorded electronically. Then came debit cards, which were linked directly to your bank account. When you used a debit card, money was instantly transferred electronically. No physical cash changed hands. Just electronic records in computer databases. By the late 20th century, more and more money was becoming purely digital. Paychecks were deposited electronically. Bills were paid online. Money was transferred between accounts with a few clicks on a website. Physical cash became less important for many transactions. Most money in the modern economy exists only as numbers in computer databases. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis. Major banks collapsed or nearly collapsed. Governments had to print trillions of dollars to bail out the financial system and prevent a complete economic meltdown. People around the world lost faith in banks, lost faith in governments, lost faith in the experts who had claimed everything was fine. And out of that crisis, out of that loss of faith in traditional institutions, came something completely new. Something that would challenge the very idea of what money is and who controls it. In 2009, a person or group using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto published a paper describing a revolutionary new kind of money, Bitcoin, a completely digital currency with no central authority, no government controlling it, no bank managing it, no single person or institution in charge. Bitcoin used something called blockchain technology, a distributed ledger that recorded all transactions across thousands of computers around the world. No single computer controlled the ledger. Everyone could see all the records. Every transaction was transparent and permanently recorded. You could not cheat. You could not counterfeit. You could not reverse a transaction once it was confirmed. And crucially, no government could print more bitcoins whenever they wanted. The total supply was limited by the mathematics and code underlying the system. Only 21 million bitcoins would ever exist. This limit was built into the code. It could not be changed without consensus from the entire network. Bitcoin was philosophically and technically revolutionary. It challenged fundamental assumptions about money that had existed for centuries. Money had always required authority. A king, a government, a central bank to issue it and guarantee its value. Bitcoin had no authority. No one was in charge. It was peer-to-peer, person-to-person, trustless. You did not need to trust any institution. You did not need to trust a bank not to freeze your account. You did not need to trust a government not to print too much money. You only needed to trust the mathematics and the open-source code that anyone could examine. Some people thought Bitcoin was brilliant. The future of money, freedom from government control and manipulation. Protection from inflation since the supply was fixed. A global currency that anyone anywhere could use without needing permission from banks or governments. censorship-resistant money that authoritarian governments could not easily seize or freeze. Other people thought Bitcoin was ridiculous. A speculative bubble driven by hype. Fake money with no real value or use. A tool used mainly by criminals for illegal transactions on the dark web. Too volatile to be useful as actual currency since the price swung wildly. Worth nothing because it was not backed by anything physical or any government guarantee. But that criticism fundamentally missed the point about the nature of all money. All money is backed by nothing except collective belief. Cowrie shells had no intrinsic value except that people agreed they did. Gold has limited practical use, but people value it because it is pretty and rare. Fiat currency has no intrinsic value except that governments say it does and force people to accept it through legal tender laws. Bitcoin has no intrinsic value except that users agree it does. Every form of money throughout history is a collective fiction. A story we tell ourselves. Bitcoin just makes that fiction explicit and transparent. It proves that money does not need government backing. It only needs people to believe in it. Bitcoin spawned thousands of imitators and variations. Cryptocurrencies. Ethereum, which added programmable smart contracts. Litecoin, Ripple, thousands of others. Some were legitimate attempts to improve on Bitcoin's technology. Many were scams designed to trick people and steal money. The technology underlying these currencies, blockchain, found uses beyond money in supply chain tracking, digital identity, and many other applications. But Bitcoin remained the most famous, most valuable, and most controversial. Bitcoin's price has been a wild roller coaster. It went from essentially worthless when it launched to a few dollars, then a few hundred, then thousands, then tens of thousands, then crashed, then rose again. In late 2017, it reached nearly $20,000 per Bitcoin, then crashed to $3,000, then rose to $65,000 in 2021, then crashed again. Wild volatility. Massive speculation. Fortunes made by early adopters who bought cheap and sold high. Fortunes lost by people who bought at the peak and watched their investment collapse. Some people became Bitcoin millionaires or even billionaires. Others lost their life savings. Governments struggled to figure out how to regulate cryptocurrency. Some countries banned it entirely, seeing it as a threat to their monetary sovereignty and a tool for tax evasion and money laundering. China, despite being the birthplace of early Bitcoin mining, eventually banned all cryptocurrency transactions. Other countries took a more permissive approach, trying to regulate it like other financial assets. El Salvador took the most dramatic step, becoming the first country to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender alongside the US dollar. Other countries are watching this experiment closely. The debate continues intensely. Is cryptocurrency the future of money? A technological revolution that will free people from government-controlled inflation and banking fees? Or is it a dangerous speculative bubble that will eventually burst, leaving millions of people with worthless digital tokens? Will it supplement traditional money or replace it? Or will it fade away like so many financial innovations that seemed revolutionary but proved impractical? We cannot know yet. History is still being written. The experiment is ongoing. But we can see the clear pattern. Money evolves. It changes. It adapts to new technologies and new social needs. What worked for one era becomes outdated in the next. Cowrie shells worked beautifully for small, traditional societies, but could not scale to global trade. Coins worked for over 1,000 years but became impractical for large transactions. Paper money worked once people learned to trust it, but enabled inflation and government manipulation. Digital money is more convenient but enables surveillance and raises questions about privacy. Cryptocurrency offers freedom from central control but introduces volatility and regulatory uncertainty. Every form of money brings benefits and costs. There is no perfect money. Only money that works adequately for a particular time, place, and set of needs. And here's perhaps the deepest truth about money. It is not really about the objects or the paper or the digital code or the technology. It is about the story we tell ourselves. The narrative we share. Money is fundamentally a story. A shared myth that connects strangers and enables cooperation on massive scales. You work for me because you believe the paper I give you will be accepted by someone else. That someone else accepts it because they believe they can use it somewhere else. And so on. An endless chain of belief and trust connecting millions or billions of people who will never meet each other. Money is humanity's ultimate social technology. Perhaps our most important invention. Without money, we would be stuck in small tribes limited to face-to-face barter and personal relationships. We could not build anything large or complex. With money, we can coordinate the work of millions. We can build cities, nations, global economies. We can specialize deeply. A person can spend their entire life mastering one specific skill because they trust they can exchange their specialized labor for everything else they need. Money made civilization possible. It made progress possible. But money also created problems civilization still struggles with. It created inequality on scales impossible in barter societies. It created greed as an organizing principle. It created a world where value is measured in numbers on a screen rather than human well-being or happiness or community strength. A world where some people have billions while others have nothing. Where money becomes an end in itself rather than a tool for human flourishing. Where we measure success by wealth rather than wisdom or kindness or contribution. Money itself is morally neutral. It is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used for good or evil. It can feed the hungry or fund wars. It can cure diseases or create harmful addictions. It can build schools or build weapons. How we use it, how we organize our economic systems, how we distribute wealth, these are choices. Human choices. Not inevitable consequences of money itself. So the next time you look at money, really look at it. See it for what it truly is, not a thing with inherent value, but an agreement, a collective belief, a story we tell ourselves to make complex society work. From cowrie shells to Bitcoin, from giant stone wheels to smartphone apps, money is the strangest invention in human history. Strange because it is not really an invention at all, it is an idea. An idea that we made real by believing in it together. And that idea, as fragile and imaginary as it is, holds our entire civilization together. We invented money, then we forgot we invented it. We started treating it as a natural force rather than a human creation. And now we cannot imagine life without it. That is the strange history of money. A history of human imagination, cooperation, and sometimes collective delusion. A history that continues today and will continue tomorrow as we invent new forms of money and tell new stories about value. Because as long as humans exist and want to cooperate beyond small groups, we will need money or something like it. Some way to represent value. Some way to coordinate strangers. Some way to enable trust between people who have never met. The form will change. The technology will evolve. But the fundamental human need will remain. We need to trade. We need to trust. We need to believe. That is what money is. That is what money has always been. A belief we share. A story we tell together. And as long as we keep believing, keep telling that story, money will continue to work. Not because it is real in any physical sense, but because we make it real. By believing in it. Together. That belief, that shared story, is the strangest and most powerful thing humans have ever created.